Welcome to the final session of the 2019 Global Marathon for, by, and about women in engineering and technology. My name is Mallory Langford, and I am a work process and strategy engineer for corporate engineering and technology at Bettles. And I have had the privilege of being a thought leader for this year's Global Marathon. We hope you have enjoyed the series and gotten some actionable advice to help make you even more successful. If you missed any of the past sessions, they are available on demand from Discovery's Global Marathon website. During today's session, we're going to discuss building relationships across borders with two speakers whose careers have taken them across the globe. This is a fitting topic for today, which is the Global Day of the Engineer. And I'm sure everybody watching today has had to integrate into a new culture, whether it means working in a different culture, different country, traveling for fun, or even just joining a new team at work. The goal of this session is to create an open dialogue about working across cultures. So please type any questions for today's presenters into the chat box for the Q&A portion of the session. Before we hear from our speakers, I'd like to talk briefly about some of the academic work done on cultural intelligence, which enables building relationships across borders. Cultural intelligence is defined as an outsider's ability to interpret unfamiliar or ambiguous gestures the way someone in a particular culture would. This definition comes from a 2004 article in the Harvard Business Review by P. Christopher Early and Elaine Mosakowski. In the article, Early and Mosakowski describe three different components to cultural IQ. The first is the head, or your knowledge of a particular culture. An example of this might be learning a little of the history of a culture before you enter it. The second component of cultural IQ is the body, or your habits and mannerisms, like knowing how to use appropriate body language for the setting. And the final component is the heart. This includes your intentions and your confidence, knowing that you can understand the differences between cultures and become comfortable making mistakes and learning from your mistakes. Our speakers today will give you some tangible examples of how developing their head, body, and heart approach to working across cultures has helped them build their careers. I would really recommend checking out this article in the Harvard Business Review for more information. The authors also put together a quiz that you can take and learn about where you have your own strengths and weaknesses in cultural and IQ. I'd now like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. First, we will hear from Clare Rutkowski. Clare is the Chief Information Officer for Bentley Systems, and Clare joined Bentley in 2016 from MWH Global, where she served as Chief Information Officer, responsible for delivering IT strategy, services, and support to 7,000 engineering professionals around the world. At Bentley, Clare leads the company's global IT organization, shaping and delivering a technology agenda across Bentley's global business. Clare holds a bachelor's degree from Penn State University and has received numerous awards, most notably Constructech's Top 50 Women in Construction. After Clare, we'll hear from Lucy Martin. Lucy is the Global Manager of Strategy, Marketing, and Business Development for Bettles' Mining and Metal Business Unit. Lucy joined Bettles in 2000 after completing a bachelor's degree in engineering in chemical engineering in the UK. She has held roles in engineering delivery, engineering leadership, commissioning, and most recently, business development. During this period, Lucy has lived and worked in many countries, including Bahrain, Canada, Iceland, and Australia. Most recently, Lucy and her family have relocated to Santiago, Chile for her current role. I'll now hand it over to Clare.
Thanks, Mallory. As Mallory mentioned, my name is Clare Rutkowski, and I am the Chief Information Officer at Bentley Systems. Bentley produces software that designers and engineers use to create and run some of the world's most beautiful infrastructure. I wasn't always a CIO. I started out my career on the help desk, and working on the help desk was a great way to experience lots of other cultures. It was a global company, so people were calling in from all over the world. After my help desk experience, I moved on to become a project manager, and I had team members on my teams from the UK, Australia, and Canada. I was then moved on to a director role in which I was responsible for setting up a call center in India. That gave me an awful lot of experience and learning, and I made a lot of mistakes along the way with interacting with the Indian culture. And as a CIO, of course, I have a global team in Lithuania, Australia, Canada, the UK, India, Pakistan, all over the world. And I love it. And I love interacting with lots of other cultures. But I have learned some lessons along the way. And I think sometimes finding those disastrous mistakes that people have made is a good way to learn. So I will share my what not to do with you first. When I was a project manager, the company that I was working for bought another company. And it was my job to train the project managers in the acquired company on the way that we manage projects. So being an American and being very direct, I set up calls with the 8 project managers. We had weekly 1.5-hour sessions, I think for about 6 or 7 weeks. And each week we would go over something new, and I would say, okay, this is how we do a business case. Here's the template. Here's how you use it. Here's when you use it. Here's the governance process, etc. And they would say, And then the next week we would talk about the scope of work. Here's what's in it. Here are the different sections. Here's what you include. Make sure you cover this and that. And they would say, And then the following week was status reports. And you get the idea, right? We went through this for 6 weeks or so. After a couple of months, I went over to the UK to see how things were going. And I took a look at a couple of projects, and you can imagine what's coming next. Nobody was using a single tool or a single thing that we had talked about. And I learned a couple of very important lessons. First of all, I learned does not mean yes. It does not mean It actually means I think you're totally full of it. I am not using your tools. And so that was my fault. I failed to confirm understanding. That's a very important thing when you're working with other cultures, whether it's other countries, other languages, just other teams. You have to confirm understanding, and I didn't do it. And the other thing that I failed to do was have the heart enough to really think about how am I showing up to the folks that I'm talking to. I was showing up as this brash American telling them what to do, and I hadn't taken the time to think about, they've just been acquired. I'm sure they probably have some really good tools of their own. Maybe we should be looking at their tools too. So that was a case of failing to consider how I showed up and failing to confirm understanding. I have another lesson learned too. As a project manager, I had the job of working on lots of different projects, and one was a really important ERP upgrade project. It was about a year long in the making, and the vast majority of the team members were Indian. And I had this methodology where I would build a project plan and throw dates in and go through status meetings and say, okay, are you going to have it done by Friday? Yes. Are you going to have it done by Tuesday? Yes. And meeting after meeting, the Indian team would not have stuff done at all. It was so frustrating. I didn't know what I was doing wrong because I was doing it the same way I always did a project. And as a project manager, you just ask people, are you going to have it done by then? Yes or no? And you make adjustments. Finally, one of my colleagues who is Indian pulled me aside and said, Claire, I have to explain this. You are in a position of authority, and we have a kind of hierarchical society. So when you ask a yes/no question, people will tell you yes. It's not because they think that they're for sure going to get it done by Friday. They're just saying yes because they want to please you and because you're in the position of authority. So the lesson I learned there was authority and hierarchy is actually very important in some cultures, much more important than it is in other cultures. So in the US, if somebody asks, are you going to have it done by Friday, and you don't think you're going to, chances are you're just going to say, nope, it's not going to happen. Here's why, right? And here's when I'm going to get it done. But with the team I was working with, they felt pressured to say yes, even though I wasn't intentionally putting pressure on them. So understanding the importance of hierarchy is really, really crucial. What I learned was it's much better to ask an open-ended question. Don't have any dates in the status report at all. Just take them out and say, you know what? When do you think you might have this by? That's a much safer question. So a few lessons learned there just in terms of things I've experienced that caused me great pain that hopefully you will learn from and not experience the same pain. The rest of my tips and tricks are really all about virtual communication, because let's face it, a lot of the interaction that we have with other cultures is virtual. We live in a virtual world. So some basic do's and don'ts. The first thing, if we go back to the head and having some knowledge, is understand the culture that you're dealing with, understand basics like time zone, and be conscious when you're scheduling meeting times. Make sure you know whether you're going to be saying good morning or good evening or good afternoon as appropriate. It makes a difference. It also makes a difference to find out something about the country. Maybe you're talking to someone from the UK and you're brave enough to say, how's Brexit going? Or maybe it's just been Chinese New Year and you want to say Happy New Year, or maybe it's Diwali. But those little touches can make a big difference in making people understand that you've taken the time to find something out. The next tip is to video chat when possible, but with a couple of caveats. Video chatting is great because you get body language, you get mannerisms, you get all the body stuff. But you have to remember that chances are, particularly on global teams, if you're dealing with crazy time zone differences, that person might be at home and they may not want to video chat, either because the local infrastructure doesn't support it or because they just feel private about their house. So you don't necessarily want video chat to be the expectation on every call. Right? There are other things you can do to get that sort of physical presence, like have everybody take a picture of the view outside of their office and post those and talk about those during the call. Video chat is sort of a double-edged sword, and you just have to use it carefully, I think. Now, you've learned something about the culture. You've said good morning or good afternoon appropriately. You might have mentioned a holiday, or, hey, I saw on the news that you guys had some horrendous flooding. How's everything? Is your family okay? You get the call going, whether it's video or not. There are a couple of other things you can do to help in terms of communication. I always like to screen share and take notes as we're talking, and I do that for a couple of reasons. One is it helps the callers stay engaged on the call. It gives people something to look at if you're not doing video. But the other reason is it helps confirm understanding. Back to the project management fiasco, if we write it out and people can read it, sometimes people can read English better than they can understand it on the teleconference. And so if it's all written out on the screen, people might come back and say, no, that's not actually what I meant, right? So it helps confirm understanding. You can send it out afterwards. Another thing that you can do to help with cultural IQ and breaking down barriers is try not to use sports analogies. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard someone say, boy, that's a real home run. And I kind of cringe because I know half the people on the phone have no idea what they're talking about. So avoiding sports analogies is a good rule of thumb. And another one is remembering that hierarchy does matter. So if you are the most important person on the phone call, try not to dominate the conversation. Try not to express your own opinion first. Try to ask people, Ashutosh, what do you think? Or Shraddha, do you have any feelings about that? Try to get people talking without you talking first. So hopefully that's given you some tips on ways to manage your head, your body, and your heart. I hope you avoid some of the mistakes I've made and maybe learn some best practices. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Lucy.
Thanks, Claire, and thank you for having me. As Mallory has mentioned, my name's Lucy. I'm the Strategy, Marketing and Business Development Manager for Bettles Mining and Metals business. I'm also a chemical engineer, and I'm in my 20th year of working for Bechtel. And so I'm really going to just talk a little about my experience in those 20 years. I've been based in 7 different countries and on 5 different continents, and I've been on extended travel to many more places. As Mallory mentioned, we've recently moved to Santiago in Chile from Australia with my husband and my son to take on this new role. And I was really asked to reflect on those experiences. So I was thinking, what advice would I give somebody about working across cultures and assimilating into new environments? You'll hear from me that it didn't come naturally, and I claim no special expertise, except perhaps a bit of resilience and learning from my mistakes, a little like Claire. So I grew up in Northern England, and we didn't really travel far from home as a family. I went to university just a few hours away, but I always dreamed of traveling the world, and choosing engineering as a career was a strategic choice to achieve this goal. So next was who to work for. Bettles came to our university and talked about projects in remote jungles and deserts, and I knew right away that they were the company for me. And so I set about convincing them that I was for them. And so that was really my first cultural assimilation, which really brings me, I guess, to my first lesson, which is really about bringing a bit of charm and lots of positivity. That really goes a long way in convincing somebody that you want to be part of their world. I always choose to look on the bright side of every move, of every role, of every challenge and every culture. Of course, in my first week, I ended up being sent to the north of Scotland for a year to commission a sewage treatment plant, which actually wasn't very far from where I started. And life working with sewage was as glamorous as you can imagine. It was also the first time that I was on a construction site, and which is a very unique culture in itself. And so this is a picture of me and my first job. And what I'd say is sometimes you'll always be a bit different, and that's okay. A good team will embrace the strengths that your diverse views bring, and you will become more resilient and independent, which really is my next learning. Within the next few years, I took an assignment in Bahrain in the Middle East, and that's really when the big adventures started to begin. There were 25 different nationalities on that project, something that I found extremely unusual coming from where I came from, but really very normal on a Bettles project, particularly in that part of the world. And it was a mixed experience, honestly. It was challenging at work. It was, and you know, I learned a lot about myself on that job. But what I did learn is you need to get to know local people, to have friends that can teach me about the place that I was working and living, and really have a life outside of this expatriate bubble, which you could live in all the time. So some of these wonderful Bahrainis are still my friends now. And it really brings me to my next learning, which is that all cultures are more alike than they are different. So my next assignment offered to me was to work in Iceland on the Fjordell project, and involved frequent and extended stays in Reykjavik and in the northeast of Iceland on the site. And really, there's no real lessons learned from this one. It's just that sometimes my job is awesome. But the majority of time that I spent on that project, and for the next 5 years, was spent in the design office in Montreal. And you can get by in Montreal speaking English. But I loved the culture there, and I thought the only way to truly fit in would be to speak French. And so I set about learning French. And my first lesson there really was that learning language is not an academic exercise. It's a lifelong quest. And but it's really incredibly important to understand the intricacies of a culture is to understand the way people speak and the way that they use their language. So after 5 years of learning French and living in Montreal, I could pretty much string a good sentence together and have a decent conversation. And of course, at that point, it was time to move again, and I was transferred to Australia. So as with my move to Canada, I was absolutely thrilled at the prospect of moving to Australia. So moving to another Commonwealth country would be easy, right? You know, just like England with sunshine, this was one of my most difficult cultural adjustments. I find the directness in the workplace extremely challenging, and I found that I had to earn even the smallest piece of respect from my colleagues. And it was a really tricky time for me. I stayed positive, I doubled down and I worked hard, and I continued to model the behaviour that I want to see from others. 9 years later, I ended up running that office in Brisbane as the general manager. And now I'm generally known for my forthright and direct style. So perhaps I over-assimilated there. And I'm not really sure of the lesson here. Give it a bit of time, perhaps, and work hard. Be confident that good values will allow you to assimilate into any corporate culture eventually. Play the long game, really. And then to my most recent move to Chile. We're right at the beginning of it, really, and doing everything that I've already talked about. I'm learning Spanish, being positive, making friends, trying to find our feet, trying to tone down my directness. Hierarchy, as Claire's mentioned, is very important in the culture here. And I'm learning a lot by watching and listening how things are done. And this was a tip that was given to me by a Chilean Finnish colleague when I was trying to get things done in my first week, was watch and listen and be patient if you can, and try and stay patient. So really with that, you know, I found friends in the most unlikely places. I found my husband in Suriname, which is another story. But working in different cultures has really, really enriched my life. It's provided many challenges. It makes me laugh. It's forced me to question my beliefs and biases. And as I start and go through it all again, I'm really excited to hear the questions and the discussions. It's been great hearing from Mallory and Claire. I'm looking to get some tips from you as well on how our individual experiences can help each other and help our organisations be more effective at working across these cultures. So just to close, shukran, gracias, merci, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lucy and Claire, for taking the time with us to share your stories. We have some really great questions coming in, so feel free to add your question as well. I'd like to start with a question from Anne-Marie Walters, I think a colleague of yours, Claire. So I'll direct this one at you. Can you point us to any useful sources of information or resources for finding out about different cultures? So do you use the web or rely on friends?
It's a combination of both, really. If it's a new place I've never been before, then I do use the web and do some reading, but there's nothing like talking to someone who's been there. If I know someone in the country, obviously I would talk to them, but if I don't, I ask around and try to find somebody who's been there before and get their perspective and their experience. So I try to use a variety of sources in order to get some familiarity with the culture and to know sort of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Body language, different postures can mean different things in different places. So I try to find all of that out ahead of time.
Great. How about you, Lucy? Have you done a lot of pre-reading before your relocations?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would say is that the history of a country explains a lot about what people behave, in what ways people behave. And so I quite like to read about sort of the recent history, what sort of politics people have grown up in, and that type of thing. And I think that's quite interesting, very interesting. Of course, when you do that, you have to be quite careful that you don't offend people by pushing that back in people's faces, if you know what I mean. And so I like to do that type of research on a culture, but without being, I think, like I say, I think you've got to be careful of being too brash with that. We recently did, we recently did a proposal and we actually were awarded some work in Serbia, and obviously there was a lot of things that have happened in the Balkans in my lifetime, and it was you do need to understand that, particularly when you're planning how you're going to be doing work, where labour's going to come from, that type of thing. It's very, very important.
I think it's great that you take the time to do the reading, both you and Claire, and not just make assumptions, because there are so many assumptions that we can all make about other cultures. So another kind of question for Claire. Thank you for sharing all of your failures. Are there any lingering resentment from the team members that you kind of described, and how did you recover from those mistakes in your relationships?
Oh, that's such a great question. So in terms of the Indian team that I was managing, that I kept asking, are you going to be done by Friday? There really wasn't any lingering resentment. I just switched the way I was asking the question, and everything seemed to go much smoother after that. With regards to the team in the UK, that was a trickier one, because I really had, I think, on self-reflection, come across as pushy. And so when I went there and saw that they weren't actually doing anything that we had talked about, and these were people who reported to me now, they weren't doing anything that we had talked about. I sort of spent the evening in the hotel room asking myself some very hard questions about how I had come across and why that might be. And I came back the next day and I literally just sat down with them and said, okay, so here's the deal. We've spent what adds up to over 100 hours all talking about these new tools and templates, and you guys aren't using them. So I'm just curious about why. And I asked them why. And I took the time to listen, and I tried to be very empathetic, and I apologized and said, you know what? I get that your forms in some ways may be better, and I should have taken the time to find out about that before I started training you right on our way. That was insensitive. So let's just start again. And we started again, and we spent the rest of the day basically doing a fast forward of everything from before. But instead of it being, here's our business case and this is what you need to do, we went phase by phase through the project management process and said, here's what I've got, here's what you've got, which is better. Let's just agree. And so it worked out to be much more collaborative, and I should have done it that way in the first place. And there was no lingering resentment, I think, because I apologized and groveled and was very sorry.
Yeah, sometimes listening is so important. Okay, so this question is for Lucy from Laura Stone. With so much moving for your career, were you ever nervous about uprooting your life, leaving your family, and moving to a new place? And what advice would you have for someone who is held back by fear of leaving what they know?
Yeah, well, for sure, I've been nervous every time I've made a move. We talked a little earlier about the fact that my husband and son moved with me, and so my son's 6, and so I was in Australia for the whole period where really I met my husband, my son was born, and my husband's a professional, he's a geologist, and so this move was really hard because I was changing other people's lives and not just my own, and so that I had a lot of reservations about it, and obviously I had to convince two of the most important people in my life to kind of jump with me. So I mean, you've got to want it, and so don't do it if you don't want it. And so I think that's the first piece. It's very difficult to make good on a situation when you really don't want to leave what you have. So yeah, I have. I think it's. I think if you get the opportunity to go and visit the place that you're going, I think that can help. You get comfortable. I think I'm not sure, Laura, whether you're with Bechtel. If you're with Bechtel, what I'd say is that moving is like you move to a different culture, and obviously lots of things are different, but everything's kind of the same as well because we work the same everywhere. And so there is so much comfort in that. And it was actually much harder for my husband and my son than it was for me, because we moved on a Friday. On Monday, I was in work and they were in a hotel figuring out how to build their life, you know. So what I'd say is, you know, if you're interested in it, take the leap. What's the worst that can happen? And what I find is that I end up relying on my colleagues a lot more. They, you know, in some places they've almost felt like they're part of my family too, my extended, slightly dysfunctional family.
Great. So this question is from Natalie Cost, and it's for both of you. Have you had any issues with being a woman in a position of power in certain cultures, and how did you deal with that cultural disconnect? Claire?
That is a great question. I think, to be perfectly frank, most of the challenges I've had with being a woman in a position of power have been in my own culture in the US. It's surprising and probably not what you would expect, but when I go to other countries, I find I am treated with uniform respect and welcome, and I have more challenges from a day-to-day level here than I do anywhere else. And I don't know, Lucy, if your experience is the same as mine, but it's harder here. I don't know why.
It's really interesting you say that, because I remember when I went to the Middle East and I thought, people are really going to have a problem with me. I was in a relatively junior role, but you know, the Bahrainis would have a problem with me, and the workforce there would have a problem with me. And the reality was the issues that I had was with some of the expatriates, really. And so I would say that it hasn't been an issue for me in recent years, and I think things have changed. Plus, I've got a bit older. Plus, I'm thick-skinned and have more confidence. But yeah, I would say there's been a few instances, nothing major really. Yeah, I sometimes feel in my current role, there's still in Chile, there are aspects of life where it's still quite traditional and people fulfill traditional roles. And I do sometimes, like Claire has sort of said, where you reflect on a conversation afterwards and you think, well, why didn't that go my way? And I think sometimes I'm too direct and can be a bit shouty about things. And so it's something that I'm really working on. And I think being a woman in that sort of adds another dimension onto some of that perception, if that makes sense.
Thanks. So Claire, you mentioned that one strategy that you have when you're the most senior person in the room is to wait for your team to really give their opinions before giving your own. What do you do when nobody speaks up? And has that changed based on which culture you're working with?
Yeah, so sometimes you can ask for people to speak up and say their opinion, and the silence is deafening. And it depends on the situation, I think, and the nature of the call or meeting. I think if it's something that's tactical, you can always do okay, well, if nobody says anything, this is what we're going to do. But that's not ideal. Calling on people by name tends to help. It does put them on the spot, but I usually preface it by saying something like, so-and-so, I really trust your opinion. I'd love to know what you think. Or so-and-so, you look like you're quietly pondering. What are your thoughts about this? What are you feeling? Sometimes I'll purposely throw out an incredibly stupid suggestion just to see if people are going to disagree with me, because that tends to get them talking. So there's different ways to do it. But I do think if you get stony silence, you kind of have to back up and call on people individually if that's what it takes to get them talking. Or make a joke. Making a joke always helps. Keeping it light and humorous and comfortable, that helps too.
Great. So Lucy, you mentioned that you really doubled down on charm when you were in Australia. What else did you do to kind of help build those relationships?
I'm sure that this has been a common theme through this series, but I sought mentors, people who knew the culture, people that I saw were successful in the culture, and just, you know, fessed up to them quite quickly and said, I'm having problems here. How do I manage this? And you know, I absolutely I get so much out of working with mentees and also working with my mentors, and I have a big network of people that support me in my career development and who I trust to tell me when I'm quite simply not approaching things in the right way. And so, you know, you've got to be open for that. You've got to tell them. You've got to tell people, you know, would you tell me when I'm doing this? Would you flag it with me? Watch me. If I'm interrupting all the time, please, would you please tell me, you know, because I need reminding of these things. And so it's that type of thing. But yeah, having a network of mentors is a really good start. And I think the way to ask for mentors really is to kind of open yourself up to the problems that you're facing. And that's where, you know, I think good relationships are formed when you are upfront about what challenges you're having.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to Claire's earlier point about, you know, getting a little help from a friend. I think we can all sort of relate to needing that help sometimes. How did you go about finding a good mentor for a particular culture?
I guess I'd rely on someone that was kind of close to me. I think sometimes there are, you know, for example, I can see Marilyn. Marilyn is on the line. And so Marilyn, you know, grew up in the US, worked in France, but is Chilean and knows the culture there. And I would ask somebody like that as well, who could maybe empathize with some of the cultural issues that I might be experiencing. And also, I think I think you can identify people that are open to talking about things, and open to. I think people quite quickly reveal themselves as wanting to help you out, and my advice is whenever anybody says they want to help out, take them up on it. And that's what, you know, when you move somewhere and someone says, you know, all right, you don't speak any Spanish, are you not going to buy a car using Google Translate, are you? But the answer would be, yep, I am. Or do you want some help? Yes, please. You know, yeah, that those types of things. So I think it's you know, take friendship really where it's offered. You know, I think as well, when senior leaders trust you to go into a new culture, they also will be supportive of your adjustment.
Okay. So Claire, this is a question for you from Beth Carter. Have you ever seen other cultures where they make an effort to adapt to your culture?
Yeah, you know, that's a great point. I would say both in previous careers and in my current career, particularly when we have a service desk that's in India. So I will use India as the example. I think that I have seen our management structure in India really make an effort to be more direct, to be more forthright, which is much more my style than their style. But they have made that adaptation. And in the UK, back to the team, with that particular team, I ended my visit there by saying, look, I am like a bull in a china shop, and sometimes I'm totally insensitive, and you just have to tell me. Like, you just have to stop me and tell me the way it is. And people have done that. So I do think it is really about building relationships, and relationships are two-way. It's not that it's one culture or the other. Whether you're working on a project team or you're working on a specific initiative for your company, you end up with a little microculture that's kind of the combination of all the members of the team. And so I think everybody has to be willing to make adjustments, whether it's ramping it up or toning it down or being more direct or less direct. It's like a friendship. You both have to make adjustments.
How about you, Lucy? Have you ever experienced people adjusting themselves to your culture?
Yeah, and I think that happens naturally in teams, that people do adjust. And I know in our team, in my team, I work with, we're a relatively small team. There's probably about just over maybe 15 people in all, and we probably have at least 8 nationalities. I think Claire's advice on humour and Brits, we kind of make fun of ourselves a little bit, and that's one of the things that I notice people start doing quite quickly when you do it by yourself, and the other people will start sort of making fun of themselves and maybe their approach and maybe their culture a little bit, and so it's a good way of trying to understand each other a bit more. I think humour makes everybody much more approachable, and particularly when you sort of point out some of the flaws in your own culture and approach. I think that people are more likely to say, "Oh well, if you ask me whether I'm going to do it, I'm just going to say yes anyway, because that's what we would do." But of course it's impossible. So I think that team cultures evolve because of the people, the cultures, and the approach that you drive as a leader.
So there was a previous global marathon session about being your authentic self at work. How does this work in an international setting? Start with Claire.
Well, I think regardless of the culture that you're dealing with, you do need to show up as you, right? Now, I do try to tone it down a little bit when I'm working with certain cultures, but I am me. I am a straight shooter. That's my brand. I'm forthright. I'm direct. I might say it in the nicest possible way, but I will still be direct because that's who I am. So I do think you don't want to try to put on a mask and be something else, even if you're trying to accommodate the culture. You don't want to do it so immersively that you're not you anymore, because people sense that. And when they sense that, even if they sense it sort of subconsciously, it can create distrust and mistrust. And that's what you're just trying to avoid. So I think being yourself is just so important, with minor tweaks here and there, right? Watching that you don't interrupt too often or that you're not the first to talk. That doesn't mean that you're not being you. That's just adjusting your communication style. I do think you have to show up as yourself.
Lucy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's exhausting trying to be somebody else all day at work, and so not recommended. I think my advice would be the same as Claire's, that sometimes you tone it down. My learning, I'm a bit of a battler. You've got to pick your battles as well. So, I could dominate a conversation if I wanted to, and I try and wind that back in, particularly when I'm trying to learn about somewhere new. How do you back off from telling everybody what you think about everything, because they really don't need to know what you think about absolutely everything. So yeah, toning it down a bit, just trying to be yourself really as much as you can.
So here's a bit of a fun question. Have either of you ever taken part in a totally different cultural experience to break down a cultural barrier? So more than just, you know, eating a different kind of food or speaking the language, something totally different that didn't come from your home culture.
Well, I've been to an Indian wedding. Yep, I've been to an Indian wedding. That is a 3-day, absolutely fascinating event. So interesting. Loved it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, I've eaten a lot of stuff that I wouldn't choose to eat. I'm sorry, that doesn't count. Iceland had the best thing. It was sort of a buried shark soaked in its own urine for something like a year, and then you got to eat it. I didn't really eat fish. I used that excuse for a while, but I ended up having to try some. So, yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, I've done a lot of travel with my colleagues over the years. I did a lot of looking around Iceland, a lot in northern Canada, a lot of skiing, and snowshoeing and that type of thing with my Canadian colleagues. So yeah, I can't think of anything specific apart from eating awful stuff, and I've done that all over the world. But yeah, I think traveling with colleagues from different countries is interesting. I've done the big long road trips in Australia, which is sort of a bit of an Australian cultural thing. And you know, in England, if you go more than an hour for a trip, you've pretty much got to stay for a week, you know, because that's a long way. In Australia, you can drive 15 hours a day and, you know, and then turn around the next day and come back. So it's a bit different. But.
All right, one last question. I mentioned at the top of the hour that today is the Global Day of the Engineer. How do each of you celebrate the work of your engineering colleagues today and every day? Start with Claire.
Well, for me, doing this marathon today is my celebration of Engineering Day. But really, one of the ways that I celebrate and praise the work that the engineers do is I run an IT department and we support everything they do. Lucy?
For me, I don't work day to day in engineering, although I work with some absolutely brilliant engineers. The way that I try and draw attention to engineering is that I make sure everyone knows that I'm an engineer, that I'm really proud of being an engineer. I am active in recruiting young engineers and trying to pull people through. We've done some work recently, International Women's Day in Santiago, and so actively support those efforts and particularly those women that have sort of broken through barriers to push their careers in essentially a very male-dominated environment. And so yeah, I incredibly proud of some of the women that we have in mining and metals who are experts in their field, who've stuck with it in engineering despite, you know, I think it's better now, but particularly those that started, you know, maybe 20 years ago, it's not been easy. And so we look for opportunities to recognise those people that have really paved the way for a lot of the young engineers that we have coming through the organisation now.
Well, thank you, Claire and Lucy, so much for your time talking to us and answering our questions today. It's really, I think, a very informative session for us all. For everyone who's on the line watching, if you'd like to watch this again later or share it with a friend, it will be available from the Discover E Global Marathon website. Please stick around. There's a message from the 2020 Global Marathon Chair, Mimi Irvin.
Hello everyone, my name is Mimi Irvin. I'm honored and humbled to accept the position as your 2020 Global Marathon Chair. How appropriate that today's discussion is about building relationships across borders. Today is Global Day of the Engineer, also supported and initiated by Discover E. We hope that you gain information and inspiration not only from today's session, but from the previous sessions over the 5-week period. The ultimate goal is that you have the components to help you invest in the best career you want. Thank you to our sponsors, our thought leaders, our audience, our speakers, and our facilitators. A very special thank you to our 2019 chair, Pamela Mamola, for a great global marathon series. With a successful 2019 Global Marathon series, our exit surveys show that 92% of you all have learned something that you will apply to your career. I encourage everyone to keep the conversations going, both through the Global Marathon community and as a part of today's Global Day of the Engineer. Use our hashtag Global Engineer. I also ask that you join the conversation around the results of the Discover E's first Global Engineer Survey. We almost had 3,000 responses from 82 countries. Engineers shared what they think were the most daunting engineering challenges, as well as their career inspirations now and for the future. And speaking of the future, mark your calendars for March 2020's International Women's Day and our next Global Marathon. I wish you a very successful year.